As I said, we continue in our study in the book of Matthew here. And you're probably wondering why we read the passage that we just read out of the book of Daniel. Like I thought we were in Matthew. And I hope to make that clear in the next few minutes, shall we say, that we have together. One of the topics that I have been intrigued with pretty much all my adult Christian life has been the topic of villains in the Bible. The Bible definitely addresses certain villains, and they are worth studying, especially the detail that we have about those villains. But in this case, we have what I would call a supervillain. Now, one of the things I've tried to figure out about comics, say, where is this going? But there's an intriguing thing about comics that seem to reach to almost everyone. And in the better comic books, they don't just have the supervillain and the superhero, but what they sometimes do is they have the discussions between the two. One of my favorite discussions is in a comic book now, of course, in the little bubbles above their heads, discussions and questions like if there were are superheroes really necessary? Because if there were no superheroes, there would be no supervillains, and would we be better off without any super anything? Well, Herod shows up, as far as I'm concerned, as a supervillain. And obviously Christ, I don't want to call him the superhero because the superheroes in the comic books have limitations and they're certainly not God. But it seems as if we as human beings are intrigued with massive conflicts, shall we say. And even in our history books, we often go to our history books and we define our history oftentimes as battles. And the battle is the example of the huge conflict. The sounds, the screams, the clashing of arms, the clanging of swords against shields and so forth. And it's something that we are intrigued with as human beings. The Bible, of course, addresses these things. For example, the Battle of Carchemish was a very important battle in history. And it was the end of the Egyptian dynasty, and the beginning of the Babylonian dynasty. Really a big battle. And oddly enough, that battle, to a small extent, shows up in the Bible. King Josiah tried to stop the Egyptian king from going to that battle, the Battle of Carchemish, where he met with the Babylonian king, and decisively lost that battle. So the Egyptian king, the Egyptian pharaoh, was able to overcome King Josiah, and Josiah died in that battle, but he was not able to overcome the Babylonian king. And in history books of the time, the Battle of Carchemish shows up as a very important battle. And that battle, again, shows up, in the preliminaries of that battle, shall we say, show up in the Bible. This morning, Herod, a supervillain, a villain who had great ability to be wicked. And one of the reasons why I believe it's legitimate to study Herod, he shows up as a prominent figure here in the book of Matthew. He shows up in Mark. He also shows up in Luke as well. We were talking about that here this morning. The Herod that shows up in the book of John appears, I believe the only Herod that shows up in the book of John, I haven't studied this thoroughly yet, but the Herod that shows up in the book of John seems to be more towards the end of Christ's life. But the Herod at the beginning is the one we're looking at today, which Matthew, Mark, and Luke certainly address. And so our series has been called Matthew, You Have Missed Your King and Even Killed Him. And Matthew, I believe, is making the case again and again with every chapter, with every word. I believe the entire book is based on that theme. You have missed your king. Your king has come. Stop looking in the future. Don't look for the Messiah anymore. He came, and you killed him. Now, One of the things that we've talked about here is various witnesses that Matthew calls. And we've said that Matthew has called some unusual witnesses. He doesn't call the same witnesses that Luke called on. Luke called on witnesses that expected the Messiah. Matthew calls on witnesses that, shall we say, did not expect the Messiah or did not expect him to come the way he did. And some of the witnesses that we've already called to account or to testify on Matthew, to Matthew's point here, you've missed your king, you've killed him. We've called on Joseph to testify. We've called on, last week, we've called on the wise men to testify. Both of these are strong testimonies. Strong testimonies. Joseph especially. Well, the wise men, but Joseph especially. Did not expect things to happen the way they did at all. Joseph's life appears to be one unexpected event after another. Didn't expect these things to happen. Even towards the end of his experience, he comes back and a relative of Herod is on the throne and he doesn't even want to come back to where he wanted to come back to. I mean, it was just not expected. If you were to summarize Joseph's life, it would be a life of unexpected things, of what we know. Just didn't expect it. Certainly the wise men from the east, magi from the east. And of course, we all love the fact that there's three wise men and they have names, Balthazar, Melchior, or whatever their names are in some traditions. And we have three wise men and of course we have three camels making that long trek. And one thing you know, if you know anything about Middle Eastern travel and Middle Eastern bandits and thieves and so forth over a long period, over a long trip, you're not going to get it done with three camels. But we come up with three because of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We don't know how many wise men there were. We don't know how many camels there were, but you can be sure there were more than three. This would have been a pretty big deal. Well, now we have another witness. Herod, the supervillain. The villain that is the most unlike Christ, I would argue, in all of Scripture. It's intriguing to me that Matthew brings out this wicked man who's the very opposite of Christ, the contrast to Christ. And I believe what Matthew is going to point out to us later, when they appeal to Caesar, we have no king but Caesar, when that is appealed to later, Matthew's pointing out that much as they hated Caesar, and Herod isn't mentioned there, but much as they hated Caesar, much as they hated Pilate, Pilate was a wicked, vile man. Much as they hated Herod, think about it, my friends. Much as they hated all three of those men, they would have had any one of those men instead of Christ in the end. They would have chosen every one of them instead of Christ. This is something that we must understand as human beings, as people that live in what is called a democracy, if you will. And the people are always going to choose what is in their best interests, which is an amazing statement, as if people know what their best interest is. I think we have lots of evidence that people really aren't that good at choosing what's in their best interest. The best example ever is the crucifixion of Christ, right? Matthew's point, your king came, you've missed him. You've not only missed him, you've managed to kill him. Well, that passage that we read in Daniel here, I want to bring out a premise here this morning, something you probably haven't heard before. And I've talked a lot about Herod, you know this, because like I say, I'm intrigued with the villains of the Scripture. I think there's so much we can learn from them. I believe that they're very much understudied, and I really believe that Herod is understudied. And so we want to obviously address him this morning, which I'm really kind of excited to do. Maybe I'm a little bit too excited to study the villains in Scripture, but they are there for a reason. There's lots of villains in this world, and there's lots of details about the villains, but the details that we have are extremely helpful for us. Give you a quick example. The villain Judas. Judas the villain, Judas the betrayer. Not a lot of details about Judas the villainous betrayer, but the ones we have are really helpful. And one of the details that we have, or some of the details we have, that little detail about Judas saying, we should have saved this money and given it to the poor. Oh, what a good guy. Oh, man, he's just so concerned about the poor. He just goes, yeah, we should have saved this money. We had given it to the poor. Yeah, I am just really above you other people. I'm concerned about the poor. You other guys that don't worry about that, you're not concerned about the poor like I am. And the chroniclers tell us right there, didn't care about the poor at all. He had the bag. He wanted to put the money in his own pocket. Now, there's some details there, my friends. There's some details there. And I trust by God's grace to be able to share this story of the Judas villain with the commissioners in Lancaster. I only give myself about 3 or 4 minutes, but that's enough time to talk about the villainous Judas, who presented himself in such moral superiority. He cared so much about the poor. He didn't care about the poor at all, but he cared about putting in his own pocket. I don't know. It doesn't take too much imagination to apply this to the people we have today that are all about the poor, and they seem to be getting wealthy, and wealthy, and wealthy, and wealthy. But the details that we have about the villains. Well, what does that have to do with this passage here in Daniel? There is an author, and if you'd like, I can forward to you more information on him, if you'd like me to. His name is Philip Morrow. Lived over 100 years ago. And what he concluded, among others, he concluded that what we read here in Daniel 11, much of it has to do with Herod. Now, I'll tell you up front and ahead of time that this is a definite minority view. However, most of the people apply this to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was basically a Syrian working with a Greek, not Assyrian, excuse me, a Greek Syrian, if you will, who really hated the Jewish people and did much to do his best to destroy them. I believe here what we have, though, is we have a description of Herod, which John just read. Now, parenthetically, there appears to be some information here about Caesar Augustus, which we won't have too much time to get into. But I want to address what I believe Philip Morrow makes the case that we have here a description of Herod. Now, we have the description in the New Testament, he killed the babies. But when we read, and John, you are correct, those are hard words. There's pretty ugly stuff going on here. Really, really nasty stuff happening. And I believe it describes an awful lot of Herod, as I've been convinced of this point. Now, before we go into this, and you find out more about Herod from Daniel and so forth, and I have some applications at the end, because Herod has, I believe, all kinds of applications for us in the 21st century in which we live. But before we do that, I want you to hear from Alfred Edersheim, because Herod is one of the reasons why he's worth studying is he was a man, and think about this, not many men are able to do this, but Herod got it done. He was a man who was able to maintain incredible power while being hated at the same time. The hatred for Herod was incredible. They hated his guts. And yet he maintained power. That is something worth knowing, is it not? That is something worth meditating on and teaching to the next generation. And Herod was good at it. And Alfred Edersheim says this about Herod, talking about how much he was hated. And Edersheim says this, yet there he was, in the pride of his power and the reckless cruelty of his ever-watchful tyranny. Did you hear that statement? The reckless cruelty of his ever-watchful tyranny. Ever-watchful. Ever-watchful. What are they doing? Who's got a plot against me? Who do I got to kill before they rise up against me? Everywhere was his mark. Temples to the gods and to Caesar, magnificent and magnificently adorned. Outside Palestine and in its non-Jewish cities, towns rebuilt. And then he goes on to name some of the fortresses that he built. Sebasti for the ancient Samaria, which was another word for Augustus. The splendid city and harbor of Caesarea in the west, obviously named for Caesar. Antipatris after his father in the north. Cyprus, and another one's after his mother and brother. And Agrippion, unconquerable fortresses such as a name I can't pronounce and another name I can't pronounce, and so forth, and keeps on naming these various fortresses that Herod had built. These proclaimed his name and sway. But in Jerusalem it seemed as if he had gathered up all his strength. The theater and amphitheater spoke of his graciousness. Antonia was a representative fortress. For his religion, he had built a glorious temple, and for his residence, the noblest of palaces at the northwestern angle of the upper city, etc. If you do a little search on the magnificent buildings that Herod built, you'll come up with over 20. And so he was able to maintain power. People would talk about his magnificent buildings. Most of you, I just mentioned Masada. Most of you have heard of Masada, that fortress in the desert, built by Herod. Herod had built that for a place to retreat to in case it ever happened when all of his people together rebelled against him and he had to go to some place to protect himself. It was Masada. The Jewish people, of course, during the Roman wars, there were some Jewish people that actually captured Masada and lived there, and it took the Romans over a year to get to him. So if it took him over a year to get to him, what must it have been to build the place? It must have been really a difficult thing, but Herod got that done. He was a builder. And how did he get his money? Well, he was able to get a hold of some of the trade routes. And before Herod, as I understand it, people, they had to protect themselves, of course. They had to bring their own security. But what Herod did, see if this makes any sense to you, see if you've ever heard of this before. What Herod did was he got a hold of the trade routes, decided that he was in charge of them, and began to charge exorbitant tolls for those that were running on the trade routes. And of course, making everything else more expensive for everybody. But he was able to harvest great sums of money from getting a hold of the trade routes. And with his great sums of money, he was really smart with it. He didn't spend it on himself directly. He built these magnificent buildings, and thus people would say, my, what great buildings he has built. We know that was said because we know that the disciples said that very thing themselves, right? He said that. They began to, at the end of Christ's ministry, they began to look at this magnificent temple and talk about how magnificent it was. Never forget, the hated Herod built it. Now, it wasn't the same Herod at the time of Christ's death, but the Herod that had built it was hated. And they're talking about the magnificent buildings there. So we have that record right in the scriptures. And Herod's name, while hated, was also revered. There he was in the pride of his power and reckless cruelty of his ever watchful tyranny. So this is Herod. He maintains power even while being hated. But what does this passage that John read for us, what does this passage have to do with this? If you read Philip Morrow's book, there's a lot more information there. I want to just address one small topic here. Verse 44, but news from the east and the north shall trouble him. This is Daniel 11 and verse 44. But the news from the east and the north shall trouble him, therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to address this morning, this gives me an opportunity to address a passage that I think most of the time we look at it, we look at the book of Daniel, and there's certain things we look at, Daniel in the lion's den, Nebuchadnezzar, his image, and so forth, and we certainly the narrative is very interesting, how Daniel saved the lives, really, of all Nebuchadnezzar's wise men, because he could interpret the dream. He could not only interpret the dream, he could tell what the dream was. But when we get to this section, it's a section we kind of, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us necessarily. And so what I want to try to do this morning is to bring some color into this passage, just a little bit. I don't have time as much as I'd like, but to bring some, and I don't know if color is the right word, but to bring some application to it that will make it a whole lot more significant for you. And that's really part of my purpose here this morning. So Herod, is this passage really talking about Herod? So what I'd like to do is go to this passage here. Again, but news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So, what I'd like to do here is address this from Philip Morrow's book. Now I had it here. And here we go. Tidings from the east and north. Morrow says this. He says, we come now to the last two verses of chapter 11, which read thus as we've just read. News from the east and the north shall trouble him. And the north shall trouble, and therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, and he shall come up to his end, and no one will help him. Now there's an unusual phrase right there. I'll just address this briefly. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Tents of his palace. Normally we don't think of tents and palaces in the same sentence, right? A tent and a palace, it's the same thing. Well, what happened was he actually had two places fortresses where he lived. One of the things that we read here earlier when John was reading the passages, he worshiped the God of fortresses. And the man was able to build fortress after fortress after fortress, gave him all kinds of names of Caesars and so forth. One of the things that you have to know about Herod, just a really wicked man, was he backed Anthony and Cleopatra in the war against Octavian, which later came to be called Augustus. And there was an important battle called the Battle of Actium, and Herod backed the losers. And that would mean his head usually, but he was so skilled at lying and at flattery that he was able to then win the confidence of Augustus. And most of the people that backed the wrong people, the losers, Anthony and Cleopatra, most of them lost their lives, not Herod. He was just that good at lying and so forth. But he had many enemies. And here we see some enemies. And so it says, he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. He had multiple palaces, but they were temporary residence for him because he was bouncing around all the time. And so what we believe here is when he says the tents of his palaces, what's happening here is he had these palaces, but he actually treated them like tents. And he actually had more than one. He actually had two. So this is just one example. But the one I want to concentrate on for you this morning, without losing you, shall I say, and that's why I only just really want to concentrate on one, there's many more, is this verse 44. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Morrow goes on to say, it is not at first glance apparent who is the antecedent of the pronoun he in these verses. And he goes on to say, ultimately, there are times in Scripture when it's hard to see who the antecedent of he is. For example, David in Psalm 16 talks about my soul being left in corruption, for example, or my body being left in corruption. What happens is Peter comes along in Acts 2 and says, well, David isn't talking about himself because he's dead and buried with us today. He's talking about the Christ, the one you just killed. So I believe Morrow is correct here that it's not always easy to tell who the antecedent is. But in this case, I believe we can. Indeed, we do not see how any fulfillment could be more complete and literal than that which is given in Matthew's gospel of the words, but tidings out of the east and north shall trouble him. For it is written, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east. Wise men from the east. And we do know that those tidings definitely troubled him, right? It says he was troubled. Matthew told us this, and all Jerusalem with him. Okay, so that seems like what we see here in Daniel. For it is written, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Herod the king, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born king of the Jews? Nothing was so well calculated to trouble Herod as reports that came that someone was aspiring to his throne. In this case, it is amazing, the most familiar of all the facts, that Herod, being set at naught by the wise men, which they did, from whom he sought to learn the identity of the newborn babe, was exceeding wroth. Remember that? He was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Jerusalem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under. Thus we have almost verbal agreement with the words of the prophecy, he shall go forth with great fury, as we just read, to destroy and utterly to take away many. Now, what about the north? From the east, we can accept that as a fulfillment of prophecy. What about the north? Well, Morrow goes on to say, at about the same time, that is, in the last years of Herod's life, tidings out of the north also came to trouble that self-tormenting monarch, for Antipater, his oldest son, a despicable character. Then at Rome, which was now become the center of what is indefinitely called in the prophecy the North, conspired to have letters written to his father giving information that 2 other of his sons, whom he purposed to make his successors, had gotten together and vilified their father to Caesar. This caused Herod again to break forth with intense fury against his own sons and their supposed abettors, as related by Josephus in his Antiquities. In regard to these extraordinary events, one writer quotes a passage from the Universal Ancient History saying that he does so much more readily because the authors of this passage had no thought at all of a recording, a fulfillment of prophecy. Listen to what these non-believers say. The reader may remember that we left Herod in the most distracted state that can well be imagined. His conscience stung with the most lively grief for the murder of his beloved and virtuous wife, Miriam, and of her 2 worthy sons. His life and crown in imminent danger from the rebellious Antipater and ungrateful Pharoas. His reign attainted with rivers of innocent blood. His latter days embittered by the treacherous intrigues of his sister. His person and family hated by the whole Jewish nation. And last of all, his crown and all his glories on the eve of being obscured by the birth of a miraculous child who is proclaimed by heaven and earth to be the promised and long-awaited Messiah and Savior of the world. So those writers go back to the prediction, of course, of the birth of this king. Morrow goes on to say, and he points out from other writers, that Herod was one angry person. Seems like angry all the time. It just seems like there just weren't enough people to kill. Again, the verse 44, Daniel 11 and verse 44. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. Now it's interesting to say there that he shall go forth, therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. It doesn't say that he did annihilate many in this case in his fury, but he went out to get it done. We've talked about this before, and Morrow's books talk about it, and other books talk about this. This is a well-known fact, that he was troubled at the end of his life because he knew that people would be happy that he died. So he called forth the prominent Jewish citizens. And it was a death sentence under Herod not to show up if Herod called you. And had a great meeting with all the Jewish influential people, and he arrested them all, put them in a building, I believe, I'm not sure which building it was, with the command to kill them all upon his death. He's going forth to annihilate many. Fortunately for them, that was never carried out. Maybe somebody figured, I mean, the Bible doesn't really tell us. In history, I don't know, but at least I'm not familiar with the conversations, but it might have been something like this. Do we really have to kill all these people when he dies? After all, he's dead, so maybe we don't have to do this. I don't know. But I mean, most people were so terrified of Herod, I don't even know if they would even have a conversation like that while the dude was still alive. So it seems to me, and there's a whole lot more in this passage, but it seems to me that it is a very legitimate take that an awful lot of this passage, a passage that we kind of maybe hustle through to get to the next part, may have an awful lot to do to describe one of the great supervillains in history. And as I've said before, the supervillains in history are certainly worth studying. I believe that. They wouldn't be in the Bible if they weren't worth studying, and the details that we have wouldn't be there unless they weren't worth studying as well. Well, this morning, we haven't spent a whole lot of time in the familiar passage, but let's go there very quickly before we wrap up in Matthew. Matthew 2, 1 through 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he that has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen the star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it was written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." Let's skip over to verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, as we've mentioned, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. So, we have a picture here of this supervillain. So what is our, and this isn't all of it, but this is the essential parts. So what is our application this morning? What can we learn from Herod? We don't usually think that way, right? We think of learning from the good guys, perhaps, but there's plenty to learn from the bad guys. And Herod here is obviously one of them. And I would present to you here this morning that Herod is the quintessential example of a wicked man with power. The most dangerous combination in history, or in the world, is not hydrogen and oxygen and flame, dangerous as that is. The most dangerous thing in all of the world is a powerful, wicked man. I believe Herod explains to us, shows to us what it's like when wicked people get married to power. I mean, this Epstein thing, whatever, don't want to really talk about that. It's like dirt in my mouth. It's hard to even say the dude's name, and I think he's one of many. I think there's other people just like him. We just don't know their names. But I believe Herod represents every Christless person who has had time to develop his wickedness and accrue power. I believe Herod is what you get. And he looks horrible, and he looks awful, and he looks wicked. But what do wicked people do when they gain power? Wicked people without conscience. They do wicked things, and they do them large, wicked things. And Herod was able to gain tremendous power because he kept on building these wonderful buildings, naming them after other powerful people. He knew he had the power of Caesar behind him. And he always would, as long as he kept on building buildings in honor of Caesar. I believe Herod represents what it's like when wicked people get married to power. I believe this is what it looks like. Death, lying, fury, paranoia. That's the first thing. Secondly, How power is achieved is a fearful topic, and one that must be addressed and discussed. Now, I am personally a fan of catechisms. I'm okay with catechisms. I believe they're helpful. Interestingly enough, when we're told to teach God's law to our children, and meditate on his law and teach his law, we need to discuss all the aspects of his law, all of them. And sometimes that can't be covered or is not covered in a catechism. And I really believe, and I want to appeal to all you parents and parents-to-be and grandparents, I appeal to you this morning to discuss with your children and grandchildren how power is achieved. It's a fearful topic, but it's one that must be addressed. Because power, you see people that influence other people, and more I hear about these unprotected young women, and I don't understand it, and I should probably study this more, but these unprotected young women who get these boyfriends and they live with them, and these boyfriends are abusive people. What is with that? I'm sure there's some psychological explanations for these kinds of things, but it just seems to happen again and again. You're with this abusive guy who hits you and abuses you and mocks you, embarrasses you, and you stay with him. Power. How power is achieved is a fearful topic. But one guy to start with is Herod, really. He was able to achieve power. He kept on flattering the people above him, and he knew that the Jewish people would be impressed with that temple of theirs, and they could never rise up against him and rebel as long as they were worshiping in the temple that he had built. If you want to study something sometime, and I don't know all the details of this, but the name Andrew Carnegie is a name that most of you will know. And for some people he's a villain, and some people he's not as much of a villain. Some of these people got a hold of the levers of power, though, and they did some things. Some people believe that Andrew Carnegie kind of bought the church. I'm not sure about all this, but I just offer it for your thoughts and your reflection. Now, how do you buy the church? How do you do that? Well, Andrew Carnegie went around, he bought organs, bought thousands of organs for local churches. Did he love the church that much? Well, if you know much about Andrew Carnegie, no. In fact, he was quoted as saying, the people need organs. It'll distract them from the boringness of the sermon. So probably not actually a real big fan of churches, but if he's out there doing wicked things, could you really say anything about him from the pulpit while you're singing to his organ? Again, that's something, I don't know all the details of this, but it's something I've begun to study, and some people believe that Andrew Carnegie actually bought the church with a simple organ. Herod bought the allegiance of the Jewish people by building them a temple. How power is achieved is a fearful topic and one that must be addressed and discussed. I encourage you parents to consider this. Thirdly, Proverbs 6. Listen to this. A naughty person, this is from Proverbs 6, verses 12 through 14. Right before it says, these 6 things does the Lord hate. Proverbs 6 is a pretty stiff, it says an awful lot of things. A naughty person, verse 12, a wicked man walks with a froward mouth. He winks with his eyes, he speaks with his feet, he teaches with his fingers. Frowardness is in his heart, frowardness being opposite of what is good. Always fighting against that which is good. It's in his heart. He devises mischief continually. He sows discord. Now, if you study that passage, it first of all is talking about body language. Now, we make a mistake if we say, okay, he walks with a froward mouth or mouth against righteousness. He winks with his eyes. Okay, we're not allowed to wink. He speaks with his feet. Not sure what that means. He teaches with his fingers. All right, so whenever you're teaching everybody, talking about, don't use your fingers, right? That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about body language here. This is talking about learning how to identify body language of wicked people. This is something, again, my friends, as parents and grandparents, we need to teach to our children to watch body language, because this passage is a wonderful passage, because it's talked about what he does with his body. He winks with his eyes, speaks with his feet, teaches with his fingers, forwardness in his heart. He devises mischief continually. He sows discord. So what the passage starts out saying is, this is who he is, and watch the body language. And then that's the guy that's actually going to do these wicked things, constantly devising mischief, sowing discord. We need to teach the next generation how to identify wicked people prior to their wickedness. Now, sometimes we'll make mistakes, perhaps, and maybe we'll judge too early, but clearly Proverbs is telling us here to learn how to judge body language. This is super important. I still have a friend who I knew in politics an awful lot. Some of you know him. His name is Randy Toman. Those of you who have had experience with Randy Toman know that he was able to tell what was going on in a room. He was able to tell who was doing what, who was thinking what, who was going to say what. Now, he wasn't perfect with it, but you guys that knew him, Jim and John, was he not right almost all the time? How about it? He could figure it out. And what he was a guy that didn't listen too much to words. He was all about body language. And he said the body language doesn't lie. The words lie, the body language tells the truth. Something we need, I think this topic is not in any catechism that I know, but something we as parents, grandparents, need to teach to the next generation. We need them to be wise. And then finally, by way of application, Herod represents the opposite of Christ. He couldn't have been more opposite. Christ and Herod could not be more opposite. They couldn't be. Listen to Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 28. But Jesus called them unto him and said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man, the creator of the world, Herod is a dot on a dot on a dot compared to the Son of Man, the creator of the world. Herod is not worth stepping on. But listen to the Son of Man. This is what he says about his job, what he's doing. For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. This Son of Man comes and he gives his life for everybody else. Herod, bro, everybody else gives their life for him. And there's many other things that we could talk about there. But I encourage you to meditate on that, if you will, and why Herod's important. And this is one reason why he's important, because if you want to see a man who is the opposite of Christ, I think Herod is a good place to start. Again, there's other villains. One of the most awful villains is Abimelech. They're in Judges. Again, I just want you to think about this a little bit. Abimelech's worth studying there in Judges, because there's a little detail about him where he gets power because he's related to a lot of people. And he appeals to them and says, hey, I'm your flesh and blood. And they say, well, you're your flesh and blood. Yeah, we'll support you. We like to think that we're logical people, don't we? But Abimelech in Judges, he was able to get right past all the logic and go right to the emotional side. Hey, we're all in the same family. We're doing the emotional thing. We're not thinking. And of course, what Abimelech does, from those of you that are familiar, one of the first things he does is attack his own family, kill all his half-brothers. Great having him around for a brother. Again, I went to this passage this morning here in Daniel. Encourage you to study it more. I think we'll find more out about this supervillain, Herod. We have plenty of detail here in Daniel. We have plenty more in the New Testament, but he is worth studying. As we want our children to be, as it says in Romans, wise concerning that which is good, and simple concerning that which is evil. I hope you will gain a new appreciation for how much of a witness Herod was, in large part because he's the opposite of Christ, and he's the one that hated Christ the most. And this you will find, will you not? The worst people hate Christ the most. Unless God's doing a work in their heart, they're the ones that really hate him. But oftentimes, they're not the homeless guy or the guy who's going to mug you for $20 on a dark alley. Oftentimes, it's the most respected, powerful people that hate Christ the most. Shall we pray?